I'm Carol Cohn, and welcome to Purpose 360, the podcast that unlocks the power of purpose to ignite business and social impact. I'm so excited about the discussion I'm going to have today because when I started doing this work in the 80s, it was really lonely. I had the vision because I grew up in the 60s and the 70s, very turbulent times for racial justice and the Vietnam War, that companies and brands could stand for something more than just features and benefits. And we did a lot of work and we did a lot of research, but it took over 20 years for some major voices to join in to this important chorus. Well, one of those voices, Thomas Kolster, is joining me today. Thomas has been called a climate change agent by Forbes and a pioneer of impact advertising by Shots magazine. He's also become one of the industry's most provocative voices. Through his work at Goodvertising, it's a brand studio operating at the intersection of brand, sustainability, and behavior change. He's been challenging leaders to think differently about what doing good really means. His mission to help brands getting back to being loved, not by shouting louder about their values, but by asking a more human question: who can you help people become? How can a brand, how can a company enable its, I'll say, employees and its consumers to do more? Thomas argues that in today's volatile, polarized, and AI-driven world, people are desperate for meaning. I'll second that. And that authentic brands have the power and responsibility to supply it. And when they do it, they will be rewarded in sales, in reputation, in just being loved, as he stated. Through books he has written, like Goodvertising and The Hero Trap, he's called out the performative side of purpose and urged companies to trade heroism for humility, to stop trying to save the world and instead coach people, guide people to change it. In our conversation, we'll explore how brands can regain trust, what bravery really looks like in an age of uncertainty, and whether purpose itself is evolving or finally being lived. Thomas, welcome to Purpose 360. This is such an important conversation, so let's get started.
You already gave away quite a few of my gray hairs, but that's okay, Carol.
I love that when you go to Thomas's website, and it's the Goodvertising agency, and then here's the tagline: Catalysts for Positive Change, established in 2010, and I love this, before Goodvertising was even the cool thing to do. So I'd love to start with, I know there's a backstory about what was happening in the world that got you to really become the counter to advertising. But I want to know, what growing up, what was the influence from your parents or your childhood that created at least the fertile territory for you ultimately to lean in this direction?
It's such a good question. I think it's something I only realized much later in my life that might have been the sort of fertile ground for where I ended up. And one of the moments where I got to reflect was, in fact, that my dad a couple of years ago had a bit of an accident, and I thought that I wouldn't get to be with him much longer, and I wrote him a long letter, and part of that letter was reflecting back on my past, and I grew up on a small island in the middle of the Baltic Sea called Bornholm, and I grew up with fishermen and farmers, and so in my early school years, what happened was, in fact, that the Baltic Sea, which kind of felt like it was from one day to the next, that there was no more fish. So basically, the whole fishing industry on the island collapsed. The kids who, in my class, were the cool kids who had water beds with like a little radio built in, and might even some of them have had a helicopter, which was, fantasy land for me. just had to move out from the next day to, the banks collapsed, etc. So I think that was my sort of first environmental wake-up call, which I didn't really think about at all when I wrote Goodvertising. It's not mentioned. And so at our home, television wasn't allowed. We would sit around the dinner table and we would talk. So just as an adult looking back at that, I think that was actually quite foundational. And plus, my parents' reaction when I, at the age of 21, dropped out of university and got my first job as a copywriter at an ad agency, they were like, hell no. haven't
No.
we brought you up with good values and now you go to this evil capitalist propaganda machine? So I think there's a lot to unpack there already.
Okay, there is. Okay. So let's go to your more current story. So it was 2009 and there was the COP meeting, I believe, in Copenhagen. And you had an epiphany. What was that epiphany?
It was strange because, I probably as a Dane and, I probably overvalue the meaning of that summit. It's one of many, right? But I kind of felt there was an optimism at that point. And again, I say that as someone who lived in Copenhagen at the time. I think also at that time, it did seem like our elected leaders did care about those types of summits. So they all flew in the Barack Obamas and Tony Blair's of Angela Merkel when she was still around. So when nothing came out of that, obviously I was disappointed and started asking myself those top questions, which sort of led to me writing the first book. But I think there was also another thing that happened at the very same time, which was that I began seeing advertising from, for example, a car brand board and their sort of claim on this big billboard, one of the most expensive spots you can buy, sort of like a Times Square in New York, was that they transported their cars by train. That just wasn't really a thing I would normally have seen in my work in advertising at that time, where most car advertising would be about how cool the car was, or, buy now and you get extra heat in the seat or whatever it might be, right? So there was those two things that sort of kind of made me curious and start for myself, asking myself the question, maybe there was actually a way forward for me in advertising. I was running a medium-sized agency at the time, traditional agency, basically. And so maybe I could actually combine what my parents probably bottle fed me with, a bit more of a value-aligned approach to my trade, my craft. And so, I wrote a proposal and then that happened to turn into a book. And I'm still very, very thankful to my commissioning editor at the time, because he bet on a crazy guy writing him from Denmark and a proposal landing in his inbox in London and pitching at that time a quite outlandish pitch.
So what came first, the book or the name Goodvertising?
The book came first before the agency was turned around or anything like that.
Let's just talk a little about the first book. And because the first book really launched, I believe, your visibility. I know that you've traveled to 70 or 80 countries around the globe. You give thought leadership. You've got clients. So just give our listeners a little bit, and our viewers a little bit of sense of what's in that book.
So basically, again, remember, I was probably late 20s, early 30s when I wrote it. And so what I did was I looked at a lot of great work from around the world that I felt was sort of best practice. So it was basically a collection of great, inspiring work aligned across a couple of chapters that I thought was important when I analyzed the work, that, transparency, being personal, being simple, being purposeful. So sort of sorted around those types of chapters. And then I had some interviews with different actors, so some from nonprofit, some from government, our climate minister at the time, leaders in the advertising world, that today, still to this day, are giants like Alex Bogowski, David Droga, who's obviously made an incredible career for himself since I spoke to him back then. And what people sometimes ask me, I kind of feel like it was a book that was written because I was a little bit angry. I think the opening sentence was, I hate 99% of advertising.
I love that. It's so provocative. It's great. It's great. Yes, I love that.
And in some ways, it's a case book. I think for me, what at that time was fascinating was that it seemed like a little bit of a magic key that I found, in the sense that I felt that, wow, you can really sort of cut through in the market. You can really differentiate your brand. And I mean, the simple premise I put in the book was actually that if you do something good for people and planet, it's good for brand and bottom line. It was a very sort of simple premise I put forward, but it's kind of how I felt at that time. It was when I looked at, and again, more or less, probably around the same time you were doing your speech in Cannes, Chipotle 2010, the year after, did the Grand Prix for Back to the Start, which was
beautiful,
great. Beautiful narration about how we got farming wrong and how we need to go back to honoring the soil and rotation and all that stuff. And so I really felt that, and that was sort of my belief at that time, and what I ran around knocking doors client side, was that this is just an amazing opportunity. You guys can like run into this, like find your issue, find your fight, and people will reward you for it. Because if you in a landscape of bad food can create a narrative around good food, you're gonna win. It's that simple. So I probably had a quite naive view at that time, but it was different times, and I think that little advantage, I think, actually did last for quite a couple of years, in fact, before it became much more mainstream.
Yeah, and then we got into like purpose washing. So we'll get there in a minute, but then you also worked with Act Responsible to set up that display. I don't know if it was an awards at Cannes, which I loved those ads because they were so in your face. Can you share with our listeners and viewers why you set that up with Act Responsible and the impact that it had at Cannes? Because, Cannes is, if you haven't been for, the Festival of Creativity, you got to go. It is like so fun. It's crazy, but it's fun.
This is crazy. I've been to Cannes every year since I was 22. Every year. I never missed a year. And so I've been there when it was, the early days, as you mentioned as well, where it was just a bunch of creatives coming together. There was no check. There was barely any clients. It was just a lot of fun. But back to ACT. So my involvement with ACT, in fact, started because I won an ACT award as one of the first awards I won when I was at a Danish agency. And many, many, many years later, I meet Hervé, the founder, and his two amazing daughters in Cannes that runs this basically nonprofit, who have for many, many years focused on, especially at that time, the nonprofit elements of the power of advertising, so the good power of advertising. And so that sort of remit had expanded again, and now they look at brands initiatives much more broadly. But so they put up this exhibition in Cannes now for 25 odd years. It's absolutely astonishing what they've achieved. And so my role in that is I think very little. I try and help push that agenda as much as I can. Last year we got Cannes convinced to create a sustainability hub. We got them a couple of years also convinced to create an open house for good, because it's very, very expensive to go into the Palais. And so I had this idea as a young creative. Everybody was, I couldn't afford the Palais, right? So I thought, in the name of sustainability, it shouldn't be an exclusive party. It should be an inclusive one. So, and I'm so thankful to Cannes for opening up a couple of hours on Wednesday between 2 and 5, Act Responsible exhibition for everyone without a pass.
Oh, lovely. I love that. So I'd love to hear just right now, before we get into the hero trap and others, what is the state of purpose today? Or maybe even like, a few years ago, because I know you see a shift, but what's the state of it? And what sort of lessons, like, can you give to people in the ad business, young creatives or agency leaders?
I think a couple of years ago, and I think it's difficult to talk about it without not sort of just touching briefly on the hero trap, was that I felt suddenly that the space became quite crowded and very inauthentic, in the sense that everybody suddenly pits himself as Mother Teresa or Gandhi, and for me that was a little bit disheartening, in fact. And one of the questions sparked the writing of the second book was, in fact, that I asked myself the question, who do I trust? Who's authentic? Who's not authentic? And what that unlocked was, in fact, another question, which was, with all these brands around claiming to make the world healthier and more climate resilient, and who have in fact created change in my own life. And the list was very short. And it was interesting because when I wrote Goodvertising back then, it was difficult to find a lot of good examples of brands. When I then wrote the hero trap and I started talking about transformative brands, the brands that actually create real change in my life, so they didn't make the brand the hero, they made me the hero, there wasn't a lot of brands around again. And that was an interesting shift for me. So I focused much more on the types of brands that sort of had a life-centric, almost like a human-centric focus. And that I felt sort of, at least for me, cut through a lot of that noise where you'd go into a corporate headquarters somewhere and it would say, do good for people and planet. But in some ways, it was also because I started seeing that purpose push back and that talk about sort of anti-woke. And that for me was unsettling. It was unsettling to have that pushback. So I felt that maybe I had done something wrong with my first book, because after all, Goodvertising has a moral imperative to it, good or bad. And I was young, and probably that was never really the intention, pointing fingers at someone to say, you're bad, I'm good. And so there was a lot of sort of things going into that at that time. And the biggest difference between the first and second book was, this time around, I thought, I'm going to create a model, a tool, because then at least I have something that people can apply in the businesses through their leadership, whatever it might be.
Okay. So one, if you don't mind naming names, I'd love you to say, who do you really admire?
It's so interesting because the list is unfortunately getting shorter and shorter. And I think it's down to consistency, right? There's very few brands that survived this decade of being or keeping the purpose alive. And let me explain that, because in some ways, I think what has happened is that operating in a world of big multinationals with multiple brands and complexities, and one has to ask the question if, in so many ways, that business model is not just outdated, that the very business model that a lot of these brands are founded upon is around cheap labor, is around pushing ingredients down to the lowest possible price, all this stuff. And as that happens, at the same time, what have happened over this last 10 to 15 years is that we've had brands that was built with purpose, that was, I think in advertising land, back to the shotgun, I think we like to call them challenger brands, right?
Yeah. There you go. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so I think that just puts an unprecedented pressure on these big legacy brands, because these folks can do it right. And in that sense, then suddenly you see a brand that doesn't stay up to date, that see others moving faster, challenging them, pushing them. And so I think the challenge is always between, like, there's a saying and a doing.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah, the say do
for a
gap,
lot of,
which Paul Pullman talked a lot about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
and it's difficult. If you're Paul Pullman and you're heading up a big multinational which have a lot of products. I mean, even Ben and Jerry's. I mean, I do mention this example in the book as well, that if I compare a bucket of Ben and Jerry's to my local ice cream maker down here, who gets organic fresh milk in the door every day. Ben and Jerry's is not organic. I know the cows have been out, they've had fun. That's a difficult reality to operate in when you're a brand like Ben and Jerry's. And then that Ben and Jerry's can kind of seem like a bland commercial product with more purpose talk than actually purpose walk, right? And I think that's unfortunately the operating world that I think a lot of CMOs don't like to wake up in and doesn't know how to navigate.
What do you feel we need to share with CMOs today? Because I know that, they are on the hot seat. They got to sell more stuff. And the turnover for CMOs but there are some that truly believe in it.
For me, it's almost like the journey that I've been on anyways. It's almost like I felt I found the way back to actually what makes a brand loved. In the sense that when a company starts or when a brand begins its early journey, they were there because they were fulfilling a need or a want. And somehow along the way, they might have got lost. And so the framework that I use is based on basically one simple question: who can you help people become? So how can you play a meaningful, transformative role in people's lives? And so what I always challenge the CMOs or even the C-suite in general is to go back to that. I think the best brands in my life, I mean, I can take my next door country, Sweden, Spotify. What's so amazing about Spotify is that it plays a transformative difference in my life, because they make me discover new music. They push me into new genres that I didn't even know that I would like. I mean, Amapiano, I didn't know I would be an Amapiano fan. Now I love it. And so by having this sort of transformational idea behind it, I could probably go to Apple Music, or I could probably, but now my whole listening story is there. My whole relationship is built up with Spotify. I don't want to let that go.
Yeah. I'd love to give a shout out to Airbnb, because their purpose is belong. And they have done such amazing things, especially in crises, in terms of opening up, whether it's a flood, a fire, et cetera, their homes and such, to house people. And they constantly, push what the product provides. So I think that's a great one. I want you to talk a little bit about the Ben and Jerry situation, because you wrote an interesting article, and I grew up with them. So I knew Ben, I knew Jerry, but Jerry decided, because of the changes at Unilever, to leave. And you had a very important point of view about that.
Again, I mean, I obviously, even though I do critique the brand somehow in my book, I do also love the brand for what it is. I mean, again, as I said, there are two different worlds that are clashing, right? There's the world of multinationals, and then the challenger brands. For me, I just don't know what a multinational such as Unilever want with a Ben and Jerry's if it's not Ben and Jerry. That's
I think
there
you go.
That
That's
was
a good point. Yeah.
I just
the authenticity. They're the guys. Yeah.
I don't understand that. And I think it was the same thing we saw when L'Oreal purchased the Body Shop, but they didn't actually want the Body Shop. And so I think there are these types of clashes that when you already have an ice cream portfolio that is quite substantial from a
Magnum and such. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't you serve a group of folks that we know are very passionate about Ben and Jerry's? Again, it's almost back to my early book again, right? Here you actually figured out, speaking to a certain group of people that just absolutely love these guys. I mean, why risk it? why jeopardize it? And the other point I think I made in that piece that you're referring to is that operating in the world of business, but having a separate foundation, is just a Frankenstein from the very onset. Of course, those two worlds will not go down very well. And when we see, for example, Patagonia, what they have done, at least they took a fundamentally different view to it, right? Because the foundation owns the business and has certain other rules to follow by. And I see that in my neck of the world as well, with a brand like Carlsberg, for example, that in some ways is also foundation owned, not to the same degree, but it's a different way. So I think they also built themselves a Frankenstein, probably because that was part of the deal when that deal was made. So it's a hot potato for Unilever to manage. Huh?
Yeah, they should let them go. I mean, I want to talk about the political, because I just started talking about the political situation. Interestingly, you're not in the U.S., you're in Europe, but during COVID-19, that was a shock, and then George Floyd was another shock, which the country truly over-indexed in terms of DE&I. And then we started getting over that and getting back into the normalcy of our lives, et cetera, et cetera. And then we have, a new president and such. And all of a sudden, DE&I is anathema and ESG is anathema and such. So in this highly polarized situation, can brands, should they even consider being purposeful and providing meaning to people?
Absolutely. It's an interesting time, as you say. I mean, I'm spending most of my time on the other side of the pond, right? And watching U.S. politics is really a passion for me. It's kind of like watching House of Cards, right? Yeah, it's a crazy time we live in. There's two sides to the political situation. I will very much say that I feel that I'm also to blame for part of that polarization. In some ways. Yeah, because
okay, do tell.
No, but as I said, with Goodvertising and this idea about framing purpose around good or bad, or pointing fingers, or saying we do this, and back to the story about where I grew up. I grew up on this small island, and obviously with a lot of farmers and fishermen. And what has happened during this period is that there has been a lot of finger pointing. When people point fingers at farmers and think they are climate sinners, and what does that do to a farmer who lives off nature? And suddenly you have a city boy like me pointing fingers. That's not a very great way of winning someone over. And so I think the sustainability movement in some ways have also alienated a lot of people by the rhetoric that we have had. And I regret that. And so the most daunting, most bold, most audacious purpose for me is one that builds bridges. It's tough to do that. I think we all know that in a great piece of storytelling, you got a villain, right, and you got a hero, and so it's difficult. But if one ad I often revert back to is, for example, United Colors of Benetton, and when Ulrich Scotty was there.
Wonderful, wonderful.
I still see a lot of that stuff. And there's this ad that I think is from, when there was this, the war in Yugoslavia, and basically what he did was he took a picture of a dead soldier's clothing. The T-shirt was bloody, the pants, and I think it was a Bosnian soldier, and it was a very dramatic image to put up on a billboard. Grueling. But the story behind it is so amazing, because what he wanted to do was he wanted to portray humanity. He didn't want to pick a side in this war. He wanted people to understand that here's a Bosnian soldier that the father that didn't come back. And so whether you are a Muslim or Christian, or whether you're in Serbia, or whether you're in Croatia, it doesn't really matter, because we forgot that. And so I think this is where my sort of disappointment comes from in the climate movement, because we've been very good at pointing fingers at other people, saying what they shouldn't be doing, what they shouldn't be eating. And in some ways that came from a place of often privilege and affluence. And I think when you're in school and you're good at math, you don't bully the kid who's not good at maths. And I think maybe that's unfortunately what I was part of in my early career, and some of the things that I regret in the type of leadership that I gave to the world.
Oh, well, that's very, I think, humble of you to say, but I think that you are sticking your neck out there. And I love the work of Toscani. I mean, I love when, the two hands together. I mean, that was really early, in your face, beautiful, beautiful. And that was advertising, it was imagery, it was communications. They weren't trying to sell stuff, they were trying to sell the issue, which was beautiful.
It made the big difference was that it really made us think. It made us question our biases, and it didn't want to sell us.
It wasn't preachy.
Yeah, exactly.
I always like to bring up quotes from my guests. You say the only weapon is bravery right now for brands. What does that mean?
It goes for leaders, it goes for brands, it goes for all of us at this day and age. I feel that when we are in a fight, and we cannot ignore that. And if you're back to the CMOs as well, I don't think there's ever been a time in our industry where there's been so much change happen. AI, social media, like everything seems to be turning upside down. And I always felt that great communication, great leadership is built on bravery. 1984, that piece of communication demanded bravery. I remember there's this story that Steve Jobs actually had to tell his board and risk his saying, I believe that we should run this ad during Super Bowl. I don't have any really good arguments besides that, I believe in this, right? And so I think we need that bravery, and it's very easy to be complacent or to think that someone else somewhere is going to do something about this. And so I always love these stories, whether it's, someone insignificant or, somewhere else in an organization who actually rises up to the challenge, or again, being a European on the other side of the pond. And we see the underdog today in New York, punches above his weight. It's just absolutely amazing. And what I feel disheartening is that a lot of brands don't dare to pick up that fight, because a lot of brands do. I do understand when you have a brand that serve everyone, that you might want to take more of the bridge builder approach. But if you're a brand that serve a certain someone, fight. Say this is enough. And when we saw the first time around with the current US president, then it was a different matter. We saw Airbnb run ads. We saw a lot of other brands being very bold about how they viewed the world, and they stood up for the values. And a lot of those, unfortunately, have been quite silent. And that's disheartening.
It is disheartening. I think the one thing that we see so much is that companies in the US, they haven't discarded their commitments to DE&I. And they haven't discarded their ESG because there's so much value creation, especially in the environmental work. But they're changing how much they're talking about it. This has been a phenomenal conversation. I unfortunately, we have to wind it down. But what's next for you?
Following up on what I just said in terms of the bridge building and all of that stuff, I think that's something that's very close to my heart. So that is something I'm working on, trying to understand that better and how I can better serve to fight that polarization that's going on right now, fight that misinformation. As a professional, I'm disheartened by seeing how AI is accelerating this even more, the attacks and journalism, etc. So that's one of the things that I'm looking at going into 2026, and hope that I in some way can contribute.
What is the role of AI in purpose and purpose branding? Good role, bad role? It's going to help us be more creative.
I don't buy that. I don't think any of the technological advances that I've seen in our industry have done much for creativity. I think everything has made our craft worse. I don't buy that. I think AI, if it wants a purpose, don't tech wash it. I see so much tech washing from ChatGPT and others where they pretend like they're putting the humans behind the steering wheel. We know that's not true. So stop telling that narrative. Be honest about it. Let's get back to AI being a tool, and let's be brave enough to understand that we can take the lead. Hollywood scriptwriters took the lead on AI and set a boundary as an industry and as an advertising industry. It doesn't seem like we like any types of boundaries. We don't like any type of legislation. And that, unfortunately, I think hurts my colleagues. I never came back from a Cannes this year where so many of my peers are afraid of losing their jobs. And for me, that's absolutely disheartening.
It is disheartening.
So reliant. We're reliant on our people.
Yeah, totally. I always love to give the last word to my guest. So is there anything you want to add or accentuate that you've said or something new?
I wish that, 2026, let's take the opportunity to be brave together. I think that's probably just going to be the closer remarks. We need it, and I think we need each other as a community. And Carol, I've always been looking up to your work and your leadership, and I'm really thankful for having this conversation with me today. And I think all of us need to stick more together and fight together in 2026.
I love that. That's a great conclusion, but to be continued, because we do need to be a stronger community. Kudos to your great work and your bravery. And we will continue this in the future. So thanks so much, Thomas Kolster, for joining me on Purpose 360. It's been a joy. This podcast was brought to you by some amazing people, and I'd love to thank them. Ann Hundertmark and Kristen Kenny at Carol Cohn on Purpose, Pete Wright and Andy Nelson, our crack production team at True Story FM, and you, our listener. Please rate and rank us, because we really want to be as high as possible as one of the top business podcasts available, so that we can continue exploring together the importance and the activation of authentic purpose. Thanks so much for listening.